Well, hello there. I'd like to thank everybody to tuning in to Working Musicians. I'm your host, Dris Organica, and today is going to be an episode in regards to gear in the studio. And what I'm largely going to be doing is just talking about some of the gear purchases I've made and some of the more instrumental meat and potatoes, bread and butter, nuts and bolts kind of pieces of gear that I've purchased and used consistently in my home studio. And kind of talk in depth about my philosophy on buying gear and what mistakes I may have made and why I've made the purchases, to kind of help people get an idea of, what realistically you should expect when buying gear, and kind of just a sort of an experienced person's sort of philosophy on gear and what's really necessary and what you should expect to get from it. And the reason why I'm kind of just doing a sort of a vague overview on this is because the next several episodes I plan on doing are going to largely be in regards to gear in the studio. I'm going to be basically taking everything I got and start doing shootouts and demonstrations of what it's really capable of doing, because I'm noticing that there just is not enough stuff out there about moderate to low end gear. I mean, if you want to hear, what an 1176 compressor sounds like, there's all kinds of stuff out on YouTube and gear reviews and audio samples to listen to. But when it comes to your more moderate and low end budget gear, it's really kind of tough. So I've noticed that I can't ever seem to find as much information on this stuff as I would like. So I'm basically going to take whatever gear I have, whether it's as nominal as it may be, and regardless of how much I actually use it, I'm going to be doing some shootouts and kind of reviews, so to speak. So I'm going to kind of be geeking out here for a little bit, but I guess the reason why I'm into this is because the last few days I bought a new studio desk and kind of revamped my room and position and everything like that. And so I've kind of had gear on my mind, and I'm kind of in the market to purchase some new stuff just for the sake of doing it. Not so much because I think it'll necessarily enhance my mixing craft, but I'm just interested in getting my hands on some new pieces of gear. At any rate, what I'm going to be doing is just talking about some of the main pieces of gear I use, why I purchased it, and just kind of go into some further depth. And hopefully it'll help you guys, out there in similar situations or buying some of your first pieces of gear, kind of give you a good starting place as to how to look at different pieces of gear and, why you should purchase some things over others. I'd also like to thank Smith & Forge for helping make this episode come to life. That's right, it's built from apples. And it's built to refresh, 6% alcohol. So I'll be putting a few of these back as I digress through this episode. Okay, so I think probably the best place to start would be with the interface I have. I bought a PreSonus Fire Studio Project as my first, well, I shouldn't say my first interface, as the second interface I bought. The first interface I bought was this little 2-channel Firewire no-name brand interface because I had preamps on my mixer, and I kind of started using that, and man, that thing sounded like crap. I still have it. I mean, I think the thing cost me like $50, and it doesn't even have preamps on it. It's just line ins, and it was a complete piece of crap. I mean, it's better than probably recording to your sound card on your computer, but outside of that, it was a joke. I mean, it's nothing more than just making reference material mixes or recordings just so you can have something to get down that's a little bit better fidelity than what comes on your standard laptop. But once I kind of got that out of my system and realized, okay, I'm going to have to get a serious interface, I settled on the PreSonus Fire Studio Project, and for a number of reasons. The big one is I realized that not everyone needs an 8-channel input interface, but at the same time, you never know. And if you're recording drums, it is just very, very useful to have as many inputs as you could ever possibly need. And I thought to myself, you know what? There's a few options out there to kind of look at when it comes to 8-channel interfaces. And the reason I settled on the PreSonus was because it was, in my opinion, the most brand recognizable. And for the money, it seemed like the best bang for the buck. two other brands I looked at that made similar products. I guess I could say three. Whereas Focusrite makes a FireWire 8-channel input-output interface, and I like that one, but it was a good $150 more expensive and had some features I didn't think I would need. Another one I looked at was Motu. They make something, and it was about the same price as the Focusrite. And once again, it had the 8 channels of ADAT input, output kind of thing. And while that's nice to be able to have, I kind of realized that for the price of an extra 8 inputs, you know, that you'd get for like an ADAT, like a Digimax or an Octapre, something like that. The Digimax being from Presonus and the Octapre being from Focusrite. I mean, when those things come in around $400 or $500, for that price, I could just buy another Presonus Fire Studio project and daisy chain it, and there you go. I've got my extra 8 channels, and I save $150 in the process. The other thing too is that I kind of figured that if I were to outgrow this piece, the Presonus Fire Studio project would be easier to sell than the other two, just because I think more people on the entry level have heard of Presonus more so than the other two, or at least that was my impression at the time. I think Focusrite has definitely come up a little bit more so in I think public awareness, more so than Motu, I would say. But another reason why I settled on the Presonus is just the cost of it. It was quite a bit cheaper, and the reason why is on the project series, they ditched the 8 channels of ADAT, so it helped bring the cost down quite a bit. To where, like, hey, if I need another 8 channels, I'll just buy another one, and I can daisy chain it, and that's fine. Now, granted, I won't be able to use it with another interface necessarily, which is, you know, something to take into consideration. But I figured for my needs, it would be fine. And another thing I liked about it is that it had sends and returns on the first 2 channels, which, you know, is pretty nice. And I really felt like I needed something that had the 8 outputs as well. I looked at a Tascam product that was 8 inputs in and like 2 inputs out. But I also kind of knew that I would be interested in looking into experimenting with hybrid mixing and mixing outside of the box, since I have and still have this mixer. But I had a mixer that I wanted to at least try this with, and I figured, hey, what's the cost of, you know, an extra 8 cables just to be able to try out a new mixing strategy? So the 8 inputs in was I felt necessary, but also the 8 inputs out I felt was also necessary as well. And with the Tascam, I probably could have saved, I don't know, a little bit of money, but as it just so happened, they had a huge sale at Guitar Center. So for the price of the Fire Studio and a warranty, which I usually don't buy, I was able to get it for cheaper than what you'd get online, because it just happened to have a really good discount going on at the time. So when I saw that discount at Guitar Center, I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and jump on this. Might as well. And plus, if and when I outgrow it, it'll be fairly easy to sell. Well, so I thought. And here's something, a mistake I kind of made. Not to say I'm unhappy with my purchase. I think it was a great purchase, and I don't really have any major regrets, other than a couple of things. One of the big ones being is I kind of was afraid of the viability of FireWire as a connection. And as long as you're using a desktop, you can always add a FireWire, you know, PCI or PCI Express card, you know, to your motherboard, and you'll always be in business. It's not, I don't see FireWire necessarily going away anytime real soon, but as you start to notice, it's being phased out. But at the time I bought it, USB 2.0 interfaces really weren't out there. I think there might have been like a couple of them, and they weren't products I was interested in or expensive. And Thunderbolt was really just kind of like a concept. There really weren't too many things out there, other than I think maybe SSL or a couple other guys had Thunderbolt interfaces. So I'm like, yeah, this is a little over the top and a little too esoteric to invest any money on just yet. It's too bleeding edge for me to really be farting around with. However, I would say I kind of wish I would have gone with a USB, just because now FireWire is being faded out. You know, at the time I had a FireWire laptop, now I don't. And it's just one of those things where if your laptop doesn't have an express slot for if you were to add express cards, and fewer do nowadays, if any. I don't know. I haven't really kept up with it, but it's like, well, 3 laptops later, I can't even use my interface with my current laptop. So I'm sitting here with my old custom built PC that is, let's just say it's using some very outdated tech, but as far as, recording, it does just fine. It's more than enough. But I kind of wish that maybe I would have looked into doing a USB interface option, with the, thinking future and forward compatibility. Not to say that I have to go out and replace this anytime soon. I'm totally happy with it, but hindsight being 2020, I may have done better off by using a USB interface, because portability is kind of a huge thing, and that's something I really toyed around with and struggled with. In fact, I thought long and hard about buying something along the lines of a RME Babyface, and nowadays there's a new version like the Babyface Pro. Universal Audio has it's like a Twinfinity or something very similar to it. Motu makes something similar to it. Of course, there's the Apogee Duet. I think Focusrite even makes something kind of like that too. But there's like probably a handful or so of manufacturers that make a small portable 2-channel interface that also has ADAT in. Some of them might even have SPDIF outs and ins and that kind of thing. And so I also knew that the RME would for a fact sound better than the PreSonus interface, but at the time they were like $700, and I think nowadays they're like $500 or $600, maybe $600 for the original version, $700-800 for the new version. I think the Universal Audio, which they now make a 2-channel one for PC, it's like $800. And then if you wanted to add more inputs or preamps to it, you're looking at another $400-500 for something like the Digimax or Octapre. And when I realized that in order for me to really get what I wanted out of it full scale, I would be in at, easily over a good $1,000. And that, I ended up buying the PreSonus for like after tax and with a warranty for about $350 or $375 at Guitar Center. So I was like, yeah, that just kind of sold me. Plus I figured if I outgrow it, I can probably sell it for about $200, $150 like that. And, recoup a pretty good chunk of my loss and get a lot of use out of it. So looking back, I'm still not sure, knowing what I know now, several years later, that I would have continued, that if I would have made this purchase again. But I don't know, maybe I would have, maybe I wouldn't have. But nowadays I'm realizing that mobile recording is something that I'm more so in need of. And at the time I bought this, I didn't have kids and all that thing. And, I could get people over to my house. It wasn't a big deal. Now it's not very practical for me to have other people come to my house and record, even though I have an actual room and studio set up for it. It's just not practical. So now I'm in the market for a more mobile interface. And here I go again. I'm back to looking at things like the RME Babyface, or actually Focusrite makes something for about $300. It's got the ADAT ins and outs and the SPDIF, and it's also got 4 preamps on the front. So that's something I'm kind of starting to look at, going forward. In addition to what I have, I don't think it's really necessary for me to sell my Fire Studio project. I can still use it with what I have, but for the sake of mobile recording, I really don't have any options at this point. So for me to start getting back into mobile recording, I'm going to have to buy another interface. So that's just something, that's kind of my philosophy as to why, I could probably still sell this thing for about $150. And, that's not bad. Get about half of what I paid for it, no harm there. But something to take into consideration with your interface purchases, are the connections going to be something that are going to still be there in the future? I think at this point, if you're buying a USB 2.0 interface is a good idea. However, at the time, USB 1.0 or whatever you call it, there was a lot of problems with it because so many other devices used USB, like printers, mice, keyboard, all kinds of stuff. And so there was a lot of interference issues, and that's why I settled on FireWire. Nowadays, I would not buy a FireWire interface unless you just get a super deal on it and you don't mind the fact that you're going to always have to keep it, pretty much in one location, and that mobile recording is not going to be a very viable option too far in the future because it's pretty much extinct. Not pretty much, it is extinct now. Laptops don't come with FireWire ports anymore. I've just not seen them. There are a few custom manufacturers who do make them, but they are very expensive. and it's just not practical. So definitely stay away from the FireWire interfaces, in my opinion. But at the time, it made the most sense. Shortly after I bought the interface, I went ahead and invested in a set of monitors. And after searching long and hard and reading reviews, and I was actually able to go in and test some out, I ended up settling on the KRK Rocket 5s. While there are a lot of people out there who say that, they're not very good monitors for the reason of they don't have a flat frequency response, they're not the world's most accurate. And I see the point to all that, and there's definitely something to be said about it, but they are very pleasing to listen to, and I can work on them for a pretty extended amount of time without getting any major ear fatigue. And the other thing is, they basically go for, on the used market, for $200 a set, $150 on the low end. All day. So, once again, I got them on sale. I think I paid about $250 new for them. And I also know that, hey, I kept them in good shape. I can easily get $200 in the future for them on the used market. $150, $200 easily in the used market, if and when I outgrew them. And I wouldn't say I've necessarily outgrown them at the point, because not until the point I start getting a lot of room treatment. I still think they're a great set of monitors for somebody kind of on the more, advanced, intermediate to entry level side, because they sound good. They got plenty of power. They're accurate enough to where you can really understand things, but at the same time, they are not a very flat frequency response. They do have a nice feature on the back where you can turn down, adjust like 1K or a couple areas, frequencies to where you can kind of adjust it to where the acoustics of your room. So if you happen to notice that, hey, every time I mix, the low end is way too loud on other sources, you can kind of turn that up a little bit so that it kind of balances out to the acoustics of your room, which is a nice feature. They've got XLR, TRS, and RCA inputs. I've always just used the TRS. I still have not yet found a reason to upgrade from them. And the main reason why is because I think for me to really upgrade, I'm going to be spending in the ballpark of about $1,000. And up until I've really got a very well-treated room, what does it matter how accurate my monitors are if my room, it does not support accurate monitoring? So really, I think one of the next big things I need to invest in is going to be a lot more room monitoring. And I'm in the process of building some stuff, and I've kind of slowly but surely got some stuff up. I'm not going to get into it because it's really nothing special other than some kind of foam packing blankets, that kind of crap. But the point is, until I've got a nice acoustically tuned room, I don't think there's any point in upgrading from these monitors, because I know how they sound and I kind of know their shortcomings and their weaknesses. But then again, at the same time, most of the stuff I mix is rock, country, acoustic kind of stuff. So if I'm doing hip hop, which I do, I know that I'm kind of guessing on some things on the extreme low end. And, I think that if somebody's planning on doing more hip hop music, just go ahead and invest in maybe something like at least the Rocket 6, I think is probably a good idea. And maybe looking back, I should have gotten the Rocket 6, but I think the 5s are fine. But if you're going to be doing a lot of hip hop and, sub is going to be a big thing, I think the Rocket 5s are fine, but I would also invest in a subwoofer. Me personally, if I knew I was going to be doing hip hop quite a bit, or dubstep, or, a lot of EDM music where people are commonly listening to it on systems that support very, very low end, then yeah, I might go ahead and buy a subwoofer. But for what I do, it's just not necessary. Like I said, I'm not saying they're the greatest, but they're probably the most recognizable monitor out there, and you can sell them pretty much, you post them on Craigslist, they're gone in a week. So that's why I settled on those. And I think to this day, they're still a pretty good choice, because they're just so easy to sell if and when you outgrow them, or if you don't like them. Okay, another piece of equipment that I bought is the DBX 386. It's a dual preamp with digital outputs via SPDIF, which are like the little RCA looking digital outs. They're not technically RCA, but they look like it. you have to buy a special coaxial cable for it and everything. And and even though it's a single prong, it actually emits stereo. And the reason I bought this is because my PreSonus interface has SPDIF in and out. Well, I haven't found too many great things to use the SPDIF out for, which I've toyed around with getting a separate set of digital to analog converters just so I could have better monitoring, or have like a golden output channel for mastering purposes. It's just they're so cost inhibitive to the point where it's like there's not really anything in like the $200 range that I'm interested in outside of a Behringer, which I'm tempted, but nah, I'm just not going to do it. But via the SPDIF in, I'm able to use this DBX 386. And like I said, the reason why I bought it is because I think it retails for a little over $500. Granted, I didn't pay anywhere near that, but what intrigued me about it is I tend to trust DBX stuff more so than a lot of the other people who make mid to moderate and low end priced gear, but it did a few things that I really liked. 2 channels of preamps, which I kind of figured, hey, at the point that you're paying $250, $280 per channel new, it's likely going to be better than what comes stock on your interface, unless you're using something like, a very high-end one, like Apogee or something to that extent. But it also had converters on it, which basically allowed me to have an extra 2 channels added to my input. So even though I've got an 8-channel interface, on top of that, I've also got an extra 2 channels, which have, from what I can tell, better preamps and better conversion. So I was able to basically upgrade my system to where I've got 2 channels of, I wouldn't say premium, but more high-end preamps and more high-amp conversion than what I had previously. And since I also do a lot of hybrid mixing where I'm basically sending out from my PreSonus and then back into the computer, I figured, hey, having a little bit better of analog to digital would help me on that side as well. So for people who do outside of the box mixing or anything to that extent, or send things out of the box and then back in, I mean, the better conversion you have, the better that's going to turn out. Not to say that the PreSonus is bad by any means, but, and I will do a shootout on this and kind of demonstrate it here in the next few episodes, but I would say everything it touches is better than what I had before. So I would say it was definitely an upgrade. But while I think it was a great purchasing decision for my current setup, if I didn't have SPDIF inputs on my interface, I would not have bought it, because at that price, I don't think the preamps justify the price tag. And if it were just converters, I wouldn't buy it either, because the price doesn't justify the converters. But when the sum of the parts come together, I think it was a very good decision. And the only thing that really competes with it is it's an Art MPA2 or something like that. They make a version that has digital outs on it, and it's a little bit less expensive. I think it's about $100 less. But at that point, it also a lot of people really like the the Art preamp especially considering the price. But there wasn't a whole lot really out there that I could read or review as far as the converters go. And while most people online would say that the preamps aren't anything special, that most people tended to agree that the converters were better. So I could understand why a lot of people were kind of bashing it as a preamp, because on its own, the preamps aren't anything necessarily to write home about, but they are definitely better than what comes in on my PreSonus Fire Studio project. And also it has DI on it. So basically everything I record now goes through this. And it's increased the quality of everything I do. In fact, I mean, I'll kind of try to prove it with this podcast. I just started using it for the podcast. This is the first episode that I'm using it over my Fire Studio project. And the reason why I wasn't using it previously is because I had some power issues in my room, which for whatever reason, the DBX was the only piece of gear that it affected. So every time I would use it, it would make this kind of like farting sound. While it would record and do everything, I opened the thing up. I could not figure out for the life of me what was wrong with it, but it seemed like it was a power issue. So I figured either I've got bad power in my room, or the power supply is getting yonky on it. And as it just so happens, I didn't realize, but there was a dresser in this room because I moved from the studio from one room of the house to another to accommodate the kids and my family better. And I didn't realize that this dresser that had lights in it was plugged in, and that's what was causing all the power issues with it. As soon as I unplugged it, the thing worked fine. So I was like, oh gosh. So I've been without it for about 4 or 5 months, not realizing what the problem was. And in that time, that's when I started doing the podcast. So from here on out, I will likely be using it over the PreSonus Fire Studio preamps and converters just because they are better. So hopefully there will be a marked improvement in the sound quality of my dialogue. But will it be drastic when you're hearing it on MP3? Probably not, considering it's just one source. But once again, I will be doing some shootouts and to kind of prove this. But it's really more so you notice the difference as you start layering, one channel over another, how much of a difference, a better preamp and converters do make. So are the preamps that much better than the PreSonus? No, I wouldn't say they're night and day, but they are noticeably better. Are the converters noticeably better than the PreSonus? Yes. Or is it night and day? No, but they are noticeably better. But when you add the two of them together, it really does make a pretty marked improvement. So for those of you who do have SPDIF inputs on your interface, I think it's a great path to go down because it does give you 2 extra channels of inputs and will basically give you better A to D and better preamp quality than what's in your interface unless you're using a very high-end one. And you don't feel like spending, $1,000 on up for a single channel or a high-quality preamp and then have to spend another, $800 for another stereo channel of good conversion. So it's kind of a good middle of the road. And I totally am happy with this purchase. I think it's a great product for what it is. Once again, if you're looking for just a preamp, I would not recommend it. But if you're looking for something to add 2 channels and get, slightly better preamps and slightly better converters all at the same time, I think it's a good way to go. Now, I think in a previous episode, I mentioned that a friend of mine gave me a small Tapco mixer. It's technically 8 channels or so with 4 mic inputs and 2 stereo channels. It's nothing to really write home about, but I tell you what, I sure could not imagine using my studio without it. I mean, whether it's this particular mixer or another one, it is just so instrumental for me. And kind of in one of my previous episodes, I talked about who needs a mixer. Well, I think anyone who owns a studio needs a mixer or some kind of a monitor station. Well, there are those out there who say that, the monitoring on these is not exactly as accurate as you might like it. Ideally, they're absolutely right. But if you want a really nice high-end passive monitoring system, expect to bust out the American Express card because those things are expensive. And that's pretty much all they do. But just even if it's a cheap Behringer, it's just a little 4-channel, that's fine. I mean, realistically, I use on this mixer, I use auxiliary ends, the effects ends, and a single stereo channel. And it's got some tape ins and outs, and I basically am able to use it to control the routing of what goes to where. And it's just been so nice and useful especially when you have a more external gear and you're mixing outside the box. Now, I don't technically run my mixes through it, but I will do certain things to kind of route a signal to where my mixes setup is very complicated. I'm not going to even try to get into it because it's hard to explain and understand. I barely understand it. And B, it's boring as all hell. But as far as routing signals, it is just instrumental because if I'm looking to mix something, I use it. If I just want to listen to something, I use it. If I want to turn the volume up or down, I use it. If I want to master something, I change the settings so that my whole entire setup is set up for mastering or mixing outside the box or mixing inside the box. Another thing I use it for is for tracking purposes. While the audio doesn't technically go through that and then into my interface, I do use it for the sake of being able to like talk back microphones or being able to use it as kind of like a headphone amp or that kind of thing. And so it's one of those things. It's just a utility. It's a tool and it does its job. And for my sake, as far as, like a monitoring kind of a thing, it works out very, very nice. And I just could not imagine being in a studio and not having that at my disposal, because just being able to click a button or two, move a fader and pan knob, to be able to adjust stuff so that, the person in the booth can hear better, or that I can record myself better. It's just, it's a whole world of difference. And the workflow you get by just having a monitoring mixer is just instrumental. And so to those of you who are trying to do this whole studio thing without a monitor mixer, I'm not saying you can't do it. Are other products that will take its place, but for the price, and I mean, you can get these things for next to nothing, and it doesn't have to actually touch your sound in any kind of way. It's just something you use to monitor and be able to listen to things. Like I've got a lot of different sources that I can plug into it and be able to monitor it without having to patch cables back and forth. So I think that's just a no-brainer. Get it up until you've got a nice, monitoring kind of a system, or you've got very good digital to analog converters. That's pretty much where you're at. Now, if you've got a benchmark, 2-channel DAC, yeah, toss it for monitoring purposes, because you're much better off with that. But up until you're willing to drop close to $800,000, I think is about what it starts at to really get decent digital analog conversion for monitoring purposes. Just a cheap mixer is fine, and any brand will work so long as it doesn't, blow up, smoke, or make an annoying noise. Another piece of gear that I purchased, used, was an old Sun SPL 2216 mixer. And while this thing is not really usable for automation purposes, as far as making an outside-of-the-box static mix, it is wonderful. The preamps, I'd say, are about like what you'd get on like a modern-day Mackie, maybe a tad noisier, but I really don't use them. But the EQ on it is very musical, very nice. And as far as the headroom and the summing that you get on it, it is way better than the Tapco mixer I have. I mean, way better. In fact, it's kind of hard to not want to at least sum through it, just because I in my opinion, it tends to be better in a lot of instances than even inside the box summing, even though I still do inside the box summing and rendering. But a lot of times it seems to add a lot more weight by summing through this, and I enjoy the tactile workflow of mixing through the mixing board. But one thing, I mean, I spent $60 on it, so it's not like I can really complain. The reverb is nice so long as you use it very sparingly, because it's noisy. My big complaint is that it does not have control room outs, so in order to really use it in any practical studio situation, you have to have at least another mixing board or something, or like a patch bay to be able to route things through, because it doesn't have the typical monitoring that you would need in a studio. This is really an old school live board, and it's actually it's not a stereo board. Everything is mono, but it has 2 sub outputs that you can pan left and right, and that's how I basically bounce it back into the interface. So, hey, for $60, I really can't complain. And for those of you, if you hold out and look out for, some of those older mixing boards from like the late 70s and into the 80s, and even more modern stuff, there's some pretty nice things out there. But it's one of those things, when you're looking for them, you don't usually find them. But if you just kind of keep your eyes open and just kind of look around, occasionally you'll find really cool deals on old mixers. And it's like, what the heck, it's $100. If a channel or two doesn't work, you're not really out of any big money, but the potential for gain is there. And it's almost like a separate instrument, really. It's not something I necessarily use for clean applications. It's really something where I feel like if I need some more vibe and mojo, it's got a certain flavor that works for certain instances, not for all. But it's, hey, for $60, and when somebody comes into my room, they see this big, that's almost 3-foot mixer, 3x2-foot mixer, it just makes my room look that much more professional. And so for those of you who out there are looking for a full kind of like a console, so to speak, you can get in for a pretty cheap amount of money if you look for old like broadcast mixing boards, something like the Panasonic Ramza, I think what it's called, is a pretty cool one. And I almost jumped on one I saw at a shop for $400. It's just, I kind of wish I would have bought it in retrospect, but at the time, I didn't really have a full-fledged mixer. I wasn't really mixing outside the box very much, and my experience was limited, so I didn't jump on it. But, hindsight being 20/20, I should have jumped on it. But Unfortunately, this mixer is this Sun mixer is not modular, so there's no real point in getting in there and trying to recap it or replace things. It's pretty much is what it is. I was able to get rid of a lot of the gremlins just by working in the pan knobs and faders and just moving them around quite a bit. And it has gotten better, but it's one of those things. I wouldn't use it for live performances, and I probably wouldn't use it for automation. But as far as running static mixes through it, it's pretty cool. To me, it's just a big summing mixer with EQ on it. Another couple pieces of gear I owned, which I got for almost next to nothing just by, tossing some friends a few bucks, is I've got a DBX, what is this, a 215, which graphic equalizer, which is just basically a two-channel 15-band EQ. And while I'm not in love with it, it is nice to have for a multitude of reasons. I personally tend to run it after my two-bus compressor, which I'll get into next, just so that if there's something kind of missing after it hits the bus compressor, I can kind of add it or take away. And this is one of those things where, like, the graphic EQs, unless you spend a lot of money on them, and they're really better for subtractive EQ as opposed to adding. It tends to be a little bit metallic and kind of brittle, but if it's just one of those things where you're just taking away a little bit of something, it's nice to get rid of a little bit of mud you might have around like that 250, or if it's just a little bit thin around the mid, you can maybe add a little 400 to kind of add some warmth, or if the high is just a little harsh, you can do some fine tuning adjustments. But this is really more so of a live thing that you'd use to kind of help prevent feedback from the microphones. But I mean, you can get these things for like 20 and 30 bucks all day long, and they're all kind of the same up until you spend a lot of money on them, regardless of the brand. And it's just I think it's a nice thing to have in the studio. And it's one of those things where, like, if you get into outside the box mixing, you need to at least have something to that extent. Now, whether you actually use it very often, who's to say, but I personally think it's nice to have it on your mix bus just in case you need it. And I tend to use it, now that I've got it hooked up, I tend to use it, maybe I might only, take away a little 4K or something like that, like a decibel here, kind of take away a little bit from 250 or add a little 400. A few little things I have a tendency to do if I have a certain problem, but they are nice to have. And when it comes to bus EQs, realistically, you're kind of up until you spend a pretty good amount of money. There just aren't very many options out there for parametric EQs, especially 2-channel. So unless you're really ready to spend professional dollars on an EQ, you're kind of stuck using one of these graphic EQs. So I think while I'm not overly impressed with it, I mean, it does the job. It does what I need it to do. I wouldn't really say it's something I add for vibe. It's something I use to fix a problem. And for that, it is a good tool. Something else you can use these as if you have a compressor with sidechain is that you can use them to help, as like de-essers and that kind of thing. So there's a few more advanced things that you could do if you have an EQ and a compressor combo. But for the most part, I use even in those applications, like a de-esser, or using it to help boost a sidechain or take away a certain frequency, using a sidechain like you would with a de-esser. It's really more so to fix problems, not to add vibe and mojo. But once again, a practical tool. Another piece I own is, as far as analog gear, is a very cheap Behringer, I think it's like an MDX 4600 compressor. It's basically a 4-channel compressor, limiter, gate kind of a thing, which you find on the cheap kind of side of things. And the only reason why it's not, I think, new under $100 is because it has 4 channels. I'm not going to say I necessarily would recommend this to anyone. I mean, when I got it for like next to nothing, it's fine. It does do compression, limiting, and expanding and gating. I mean, it's a tool just like the DBX is. However, it's a piece that kind of works when used sparingly on the 2-bus. It can work in other applications as well. But For those who have not really experienced mixing through a bus compressor, I really think you're missing out. I would say it definitely makes my workflow a lot quicker. And there are instances where I enjoy using a compressor that's hardware versus plugins. And one of the big instances is primarily when it comes to bus compression, primarily on the 2 bus, right? That I end up sending back into the interface after the summed mix. And like I said, would I necessarily recommend this? Not necessarily, but it's one of those things where I think I've definitely outgrown it. And there's a few different compressors I'm looking at. One of which is like the Art Pro VLA, which is a pretty common low-end but decent compressor for a 2 bus. There's actually a Joe Meek stereo compressor I'm looking at, but I'm really hoping I can kind of forego those two and get into something from Chameleon Labs, which is more of an SSL style compressor. Reason being is for me, you want a bus compressor to have the ability to be transparent. While it's nice to have the options of different characters, I'd say more times than not, you want your bus compressor to be transparent. But in the case of the Behringer, it is not transparent. And it's one of those things where you have to use sparingly. And it's almost kind of like by the time you start to notice that the gain reduction lights come on, it's too much. So, I mean, as far as the lights go, very seldomly do I let it even hit 3. I just put a little bit on there and kind of just kiss it a little bit. Most of the time, you don't even see the red light for gain reduction coming on. And if it does, it usually hits the 1 decibel light. Although I don't really trust the metering on this particular unit. I just have to use my ear. But I will say that what it really does is add meat and weight to what I'm doing. So I use it more so as an effect. I'd say that I would typically use like a compressor. Like if I had an SSL style compressor, I would be able to use it very, very differently. But it's one of those things where when used sparingly, you tend to not have to use as much compression on your individual tracks. And it also makes balancing, I think, a little bit easier. Even though I'm very seldomly probably doing much more than 3 or so decibels of gain reduction at any time on the bus, I will say using it does help make the tracks come together a little quicker, and you could say it kind of glues things together, although there are plenty of instances where I realized that this used on my stereo bus is not going to be a good choice, and I will stay away from it. But it's one of those things, it just really does add a little bit of weight. But if you push it too hard, it's not so much that it distorts. It really doesn't do that, which I almost kind of wish I could get it to do more so I could use it for other applications. The problem I have with it is that it kind of like just basically puts like a blanket over everything. It just sucks out all the high end, and it's not a very quality compressor when you used in heavy doses like you could with a nice SSL type of compressor. But used moderately, it does help. Another thing where I think it's a good idea to at least have like a 1 or 2 cheap outboard compressors, even if it's something like this, is where I think it's really the most useful is if you're using something like, I don't know, parallel processing, and you just need something to be squashed. I think it does a great job for that. I use it pretty much when I mix. Since it's a four channel compressor, I use 2 of the channels on the stereo bus right before it hits the DBX 215 EQ, right? And then from there, it then goes back into the DBX 386 and it prints from there. But I also use auxiliary returns and have it routed to where I can use it as parallel compression on my mix bus. And I think that in this application, even a cheap compressor will do this just fine. I could easily see somebody, with a nice full-scale setup. It's like if you just need a couple of compressors to add some weight in parallel on your mix bus or your drum bus, it doesn't really matter. Now, if you're looking for something like a crush bus or your drum bus, this is not what you're looking for. But, it's one of those things, if you're setting your attack or your ratio at like 2 or 4 to 1, it does that pretty well, and it's cheap. You don't need anything real high end for that. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend this unit, but as far as if you need something, it's a good introductory piece to kind of get you into it. And I would say it's not necessarily better than plugins. It's just different and is better suited for certain applications than plugins. But most of the time I end up using plugins over this. And this will be something I will review and to give you some examples of. But that's just kind of my 2 cents on this particular cheap outboard compressor. And finally, I'm going to just talk briefly about microphones. Between the microphones I personally own or co-own or have access to, I have an Octava MK319. It's a large diaphragm condenser. It finally got dropped enough times to where, and it's all dirty, to where it doesn't really work very cleanly, but it was an okay microphone. I'm not saying it's a very good microphone for modding purposes. So if you can get one cheap, the capsules are actually pretty good. And so if you can just replace the other guts of it, transformers in particular, you can actually get a much higher end microphone sound out of it. It's a very good microphone for modding. But when I realized that the capsule's kind of gone to crap, I'm just like, yeah, whatever. But I also own a couple of Dynamics, an SM57 and an Audix i5. Can't recommend those 2 microphones enough. They're just great for all-around things. And I also have a Audio Technica 3035, I believe. And I think it was about a $200 to $300 microphone new. I didn't buy it new. I got it for like $80. But it's one of those things. It's not a great large diaphragm condenser, but it's one of those things. It's usable. It gets the job done. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but I wouldn't turn away from it if the price was right. It's just one of those things. When you need a condenser microphone, it'll get the job done. It's maybe not the most flattering microphone, but it's neutral. It does okay for just about anything you could need it for. And then I also own a Atlantis Audio microphone, which I really haven't had that long. And I can't recommend this thing enough. It's just hard for me to recommend a microphone that costs, $1,500 to $1,800, something like that. But I'll definitely be reviewing microphones in a lot more detail, I believe, in my next episode. So that's pretty much all I have as far as like my main pieces of gear that I use on a consistent basis outside from, computer, keyboard, mouse, and all that kind of stuff. But I just wanted to kind of talk to you about what my overall setup is, because the next several episodes, I'm going to be reviewing a lot of these pieces and kind of how to use them and that kind of thing. And the next episode will primarily be about microphones. So I wanted to kind of give you all a precursor as to what to expect in the next episodes, and just be on the lookout for some cool reviews, because I'm always looking for people reviewing cheap gear, and because there's just not enough of it out there for, I think, most of us to make good informed decisions. While there is definitely some really, really bad gear out there, I'm not going to get into it. If there's something I think really sucks, I just won't talk about it. But at any rate, I want to kind of keep y'all posted. So be on the lookout for a full-scale shootout of some of the microphones I own, and kind of give you an explanation of what you can expect from different microphones. And I'll make some good overall recommendations for, microphone purchases, depending on where you're at in your studio career. All right. Thanks for checking me out, guys. I'll talk to y'all next time. Bye.